Well, thank you for that introduction. And it is very good to be back here, I think, amongst a lot of old friends and possibly one or two old adversaries too. Certainly in my current job, that business, you know when you haven't seen people for a while and you meet them and you can't quite remember where you saw them. If you're Chief Inspector of Prisons, that can be a real social minefield because you think, and then, but anyhow, you get the picture. So, I thought before I begin, if I can see you all, I want to do a little kind of audience test, right? Because I want to talk a bit about prisons. But first of all, just how many of you in the room have gone into prisons much? I don't mean gone in and interviewed a prisoner in a visits room or taken someone into reception, but actually spent time, say, up on the wings talking to prisoners or actually in reception seeing what happens to people when they come in. So who's done that? Okay, so quite a lot of you, but not everybody, not everybody. So I want to talk a bit about, say what I find and my experience of that. I should say, actually, being Chief Inspector of Prisons following, I did 7 years at the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and this job at one level feels like a bit of a rescue, actually. And there are some of it, I think. Someone was asked me earlier whether I prefer it. I certainly think on one level it's more productive. The problem with the IPCC is that it was difficult to see the world in other than black or white. It's a very adversarial system. And at least with the Prisons Inspectorate, you can do grey. And because most things are shades of grey rather than simplistic black and white, and you don't have to give simple yes or no answers, and you can help people do things better rather than simply point out what they're doing wrong. And so at that level, it's a more satisfactory role. So what I wanted to talk about then is a bit about what we find in prisons, and then I wanted to talk about some of the similarities or some of the similar challenges that the police service and prison service are dealing with. And I say this, I think I can claim that very few other people from outside either of those services will have had the same opportunities as me to see as an outsider close up how the two disciplined uniform parts of the criminal justice system work. I don't think there will be many other people who've done that. And so I hope that has given me some insights. To say something briefly about the Inspector of Prisons, there's a long history of prison inspection in the UK. I think it probably predates the Police Inspectorate, not that we're competitive. And the first person who you could reasonably call a prison inspector was a man called John Howard. And John Howard was the High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, and part of it in the late 18th century. Late 1700s, and part of his duties was to go and inspect the conditions in the county jail. And rather than pay somebody to go and do it for himself, he went to go and do it for him. He went to look for himself. And he was so appalled by the conditions he found, he spent the rest of his life galloping around the country, banging on the prison gates, demanding to go in, talking to the people he found, writing about what he found, and demanding change, which is not so very different from what we do today. The Inspectorate in its current form was established in 1981, and my statutory duty is to report on the treatment of prisoners and the conditions in prisons. And that remit's now been extended to immigration detention. And also now with HMIC, we inspect police custody. So we certainly have knocked on some of your doors or may do in future. So let me just tell you about some of them, what we find when we are in prisons. First of all, there's the business about who's there. It always strikes me, I'm always slightly surprised when I speak to police about who's in prison. that they don't really understand who's there. Of course, who's there are the people who go through your custody streets and the people you deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it shouldn't come as a shock to you. So on the one hand, there's no doubt over the last few years, the proportion of prisoners doing long sentences in there for serious offences and getting longer sentences for equivalent sentences has grown. So in 1993, you had about 45% of prisoners doing sentences of 4 years or more. In 2013, that was 55%. And so you've got a significant proportion of people in prison you might characterize as kind of angry young men still, I think. But on the other side, of course, you've got a lot of the people you deal with on the streets, people with mental health problems, people with drug and alcohol abuse issues, people with learning difficulties, people often with a very poor education, a very poor family support. In terms of demographics, about 5% of the prison population are women, a bit less than 5% actually. So most people obviously are men. You've got about 26% who are from minority ethnic backgrounds and about 14% from Muslims. So massively overrepresented, overrepresentation from those communities. The other thing that's happening, I think, in prisons, one of the things that's really surprising when you go in, at least for me, is the proportion of the number of older men you now see. So the number of men who are going around on their walking frames, or in some places in the prisons with really big sites where it's difficult to get about, you'll have a little row of motability scooters lined up so people can kind of get about, right? And the fastest growing part of the prison population are older prisoners, men aged over 60 and over. And if you want to scare people who run the prison service, you look at them sympathetically and say you are now one of the largest providers of residential care for the frail elderly in the country, which they are, right? Which they are. On the other hand, the proportion of the number of young people, particularly under 18-year-olds in custody, has fallen dramatically. To be honest, nobody quite knows why that's the case. It reflects a fall in the numbers of young people entering the criminal justice system. To some extent, that reflects probably good work by some of you. It reflects good work by the Youth Justice Board, I think. Some people say it's all down to lead in petrol. But nevertheless, there has been a really significant drop. There's about 1,000 boys, just mainly boys, under 18 in custody now. And while that fall has been a good thing, I think, a consequence is that the boys who are left are, you could characterize them as, our most troubled and troublesome young people. And frankly, the system doesn't really know what to do with them. So you can just about contain them when they're there, but doing much more than that, we don't really yet know what to do. And I'll come back to that. So that's a bit about who's there. And here are some things you need to know. The first thing you need to know is that there are no holiday camps. Right? The holiday camps are a myth. Right? Now, you may think that poor conditions are reasonable for people who've broken the law and they deserve to be punished. That's a reasonable argument to have. It's not a reasonable argument to say that they are all living in luxury, because it's simply not true. Right? And I would say, and we said in our annual report last year, that too many prisons are places of violence, squalor, and idleness. When I go to a prison, I can draw keys and I can go where I want, and of course I can leave at any time, I think. But I'm surprised how pleased I am, relieved I am to get out again. I'm surprised at my own reaction to it. You know, the kind of claustrophobia, the smell, and the sense of the clanging gates, and the sense of hopelessness often that's there, and the depression So I'm always really pleased to get out. Last year, I think it's true to say, though, that if one looked at a longer-term trend over 10 or 20 years, or maybe longer, you could say that prisons have improved. But certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a very sharp decline. So last year, when the inspections we did, we said that only about half were safe enough, compared with only about 1 in 5 the year before. Levels of education and training, which are sort of essential. If you're going to keep people busy and out of trouble when they're in prison, let alone give them a chance of a job so they don't get into trouble when they leave. Levels of education and training were only just about good enough in a third of the prisons we went to, compared with 2/3 2 years ago. And we found that 1 in 5 prisoners were spending less than 2 hours a day out of their cell. Right? And so it's hard to imagine anything less likely to rehabilitate prisoners than days spent lying on their bunks watching daytime telly. Right? Whatever else you think, that's not going to work. That's not going to make things better when they come out. And I think if you talk to some audiences, you know, their image of prison is porridge. People remember porridge here? Yeah, okay, porridge, right? So you remember like porridge, which is, for the people who don't remember, it's a sitcom with Ronnie Barker in it, and Ronnie Barker was the old like Fletcher, and he was in with his cellmate, Gobber, and there were 2 prison officers. There was Mr. Mackay, the stern senior officer, and Mr. Barraclough, the sort of weedy, wimpy one who Fletcher rings around. Well, to make the plot work, if you remember that, the first thing to say is that the cells in Porridge, set in the 1970s, were enormous. Right? The cells were enormous. If you go into a cell now, you have 2 people, maybe it will be about a bit wider than my outstretched arms that way, and maybe twice as long, 2 people with an unscreened toilet, twice for 22 hours a day. And you certainly won't have friendly or unfriendly prison officers dropping in for a chat, because there aren't enough of them to do that anymore. I watched one episode the other day, and Gobbo, the younger officer, comes back, you know, the storyline is he comes back into the cell from his Spanish classes before going off to his boxing lesson. Well, it ain't like that in Wandsworth Prison now, I can tell you. So you've got people stuck in cells for long periods. The other real concern at the moment is about levels of violence. You know, certainly I find this quite shocking, and levels of violence are increasing. So last year, if you look at NOMS's, the Prison Service's own figures, last year, in a typical week, so this is in 1 week in the prison system, just in 1 week, right? There were 300, average week, there were 300 violent incidents. That was up 11% on the year before. Almost 40 of those incidents every week caused serious injury. That was up 31%. There were almost 70 assaults on staff. That was up 9%. About 8 of those caused serious injury, up 31%. There were 475 self-harm incidents every week, up 6%. And 1 or 2 prisoners killed themselves, usually by ligatures from a window or a bed. And that was a slight decrease from the year before, but the trend is certainly up. And there's a homicide about once every 3 months. All of those figures are going up. And I suppose you might think, well, kind of, so what? You know, that's, you know, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, etc. Well, my argument would be, you know, the vast majority of these people are going to come out, and they're going to come out onto your patch. And if you think any of this is likely to make them less of a problem than when they went in, I think you are mistaken. So you've got that, first of all. The second thing that you need to know about prisons is about crime in prisons. Right? I think part of the problem is, certainly with the police, what we find, is that when people go into prison, you forget all about them. Well, lots of them are still busy and active, right? So it's not very difficult to get a phone in a prison. In fact, it's very easy. You can get tiny little phones now, and you can put them where the sun doesn't shine, and you can get them in. And you can use that to harass victims and witnesses or continue to run your criminal enterprises should you be so inclined. The other big issue that's happening in prisons at the moment is a surge in the availability of new psychoactive substances, legal highs, right? And they are destabilizing the system. And the way it works is because they're legal on the outside, you can buy them cheap, but because they're expensive in prison, you can sell them dear. Right? So whereas the difference between the street price and the prison price for an opiate is about 3 times, the difference in the street price and the prison price for a new psychoactive substance, a legal high, is about 10 times. So the profits are enormous. So you can buy them cheap, you can try and get them in, even if lots get intercepted, there are still big profits to be made. And of course, because they are illegal on the outside, there's no risk of criminal charges if you have them on you before you get them in. They are almost impossible to detect with current testing methods. So low risk to have in your possession, very difficult to detect, big profits to make. What's not to like? And what you've got certainly in some prisons is organized criminal gangs organizing the supply into the prison, collecting the profits from it outside. So collecting the profits from the family and associates of prisoners rather than from prisons inside, and using that to fund their business. So I can tell you this as well. The supply of these things in prisons isn't simply a problem for the prison. It's a problem, again, for you as well, because the money is going back into feeding the activities of the gangs that supply it. It's not very difficult to get the stuff in, right? You can, it comes in on packages and in paper. So you can spray, I heard the other day, you can spray MPS on paper. So if you get in a book or a magazine, spray it on that, you roll it and you smoke it. That's the way of getting it in. It'll come in with visitors, it will come in with prisoners, so you pay someone who's out to get themselves recalled, and they come in with a big package stuffed up them, and then they can sell it, and that's worth a couple of weeks inside. And of course, it will come in with staff. You can't tell, or contractors, so you can't tell exactly what are the proportions, and they differ from place to place. But the point about that is, one of the points about that is the prison service does not have the capacity and is not set up to investigate crime. Right? They can gather intelligence, they can take security measures, but they can't investigate crime. So if they're going to stop that, if they're going to deal with corruption, if that's what's happening, if they're going to deal with the gangs that are supplying it, they have to turn to you for that support. And sometimes we go and we see really good relationships where that is happening really well. But sometimes there is a kind of washing your hands of it because it's happening behind the walls and it's not really your problem. Well, as I say, it will be your problem. And I would urge you to have the kind of relationships with people, with the prison service that enable you to get a grip on these things. And frankly, you know, if people's staff are being beaten up in custody, or even prisoners are being beaten up, come to that, it's a crime and it needs to be investigated and dealt with, and people need to see it being investigated and dealt with. I went to Feltham Young Offenders Institution the other day, where they have, you know, some of these really difficult, really challenging boys. I use the word boys advisedly because you look at them, they are boys. Boys is the right word, but they have often done, they've done terrible things. And certainly part of the way the gangs are operating inside is that there will be a degree of initiation about it. You have to take part in an attack in order to, otherwise you'll be next in line. And I remember we watched, it's all on CCTV, and I remember watching one incident where there's a group of boys, they launched this attack on one victim. And he's on the floor, and they're kicking him really in the head. They're trying to kick him in the head. And I remember the staff come bursting in, and they're trying to, the attack's still going on. And one woman officer, she crouches down on the floor and leans over the boy's head so she can protect his head and stop it getting kicked. So, and then she's getting kicked and she's getting hit. And you look at it and you think it's really sort of despairing in a way. It's despairing because, not merely because of what's happening to the victim or what's happening to the member of staff, but the boys who are doing the attack know that it's not like some sort of hole in the corner, trying to not be seen. It's done in full view of staff. So it's not merely that they don't care what's going to happen to the victim, they don't care what's going to happen to them either. And there's a sort of sense, you watch it, and there's a real sense of hopelessness about it. Then I think two other. I think it's really important. I think that the staff in prisons, if they are assaulted, deserve to have that treated as a crime like any other crime. And it's not, I think, just kind of washing your hands. What's the good of it because they're inside anyhow? I think they certainly find that really disheartening and demoralising, and it's not fair to them, I think. And then you get two other things you should know about prison. Well, two other groups, two other things about crime I think I wanted to say. First of all, there's a thing around radicalisation, which is topical at the moment. And I think people have to be really careful that they develop strategies to deal with radicalisation and terrorist prisoners on the basis of evidence and facts rather than the next day's headline. As far as we can tell what's happening in prison, there are a small group, probably no more than a dozen or so, who are actively trying to radicalise and influence other prisoners from an Islamist perspective. Then there's a much larger group who are involved in gang activity, for whom the Muslim thing may or may not be a cover for their activity, but is certainly used to try and divert attention from what is common or garden acquisitive or violent crime. Then there's a group who are devout. And it's certainly a common thing where people will go to prison, they'll develop a religion, and generally that can be a protective factor. Look at Jonathan Aitken, for instance. Right? And then, of course, there's the boys who are fed up with being stuck in their cell, and they can get out of their cell on a Friday and go into prayers and muck about. And that's quite a big incentive. And if you try and treat all of those things in the same way, you'll fail. Right? And what you also have to be really careful about, I think, and I've heard people advocate this recently, is the way to solve the problem is you sort of stick all the most serious offenders, the most serious terrorists together on one wing and you segregate them in some way. Well, I think you have to be really careful before you go down that route. If you want to see, look at an example, go to Maghaberry Prison in Northern Ireland, where they have Row House, which is where they keep the active Republican prisoners, where it's become a no-go area for staff. It becomes a rallying point for their supporters out in the community, and they sit there reinforcing each other's ideology. It is completely counterproductive, it seems to me. Or you can look at sex offender prisons. You separate sex offenders because they're at risk from other prisoners. But if you get sex offenders who are in denial of their offence or won't admit the seriousness of what they've done, and you put them all together, what you get them doing is feeding off each other's behaviours and kind of fantasies. And I think there's a real danger that if you put people with a particular ideology, you stick them all together, you might be able to contain it, but actually what you'll be doing is reinforcing those behaviours. You certainly won't be kind of addressing it. And I think we have to think very carefully before we go down that route. A couple of other things I wanted to say. First of all, I think on prisons, first of all, I think you have to look at the reoffending rates when people leave. Certainly for low-level offenders, the reoffending rates for people doing a custodial sentence are much higher than the reoffending rates for people doing some sort of a community sentence. Now, one explanation for that is that the people who are likely to reoffend are the ones most likely to get a custodial sentence, so you're not comparing like with like. But I think it's certainly true to say that you can't find evidence that proves conclusively that giving someone a custodial sentence is more likely to prevent them, more likely to stop them reoffending when they leave than a community sentence. Stops them, of course, when they're in there, and I don't say that's not important, it is important, but it doesn't have much effect when they leave. And then you have to think about the cost. Right? Then you have to think about the cost, as they've done in the States. Don't think you can solve the crime problem, you can imprison your way out of the crime problem. It costs about £36,000 per year on average to keep a prisoner in prison, £36,000 a year. And the population, prison population today, when I looked at it, was 85,741. About twice, actually, what it was when I started working in the 1980s. And I'm not sure we're twice as safe, but still. And so the cost of that is about £3.1 billion. Prison Service has done projections about what the future population will look like. And they can work it out because it's simply because of the older prisoners, the people doing long sentences, you can do it with a degree of accuracy. So the middle and most likely scenario takes the population by 2020 up to about 90,000. The highest scenario takes it up to about 100,000, and the lowest scenario takes it down to about 80,000. Right? So you're talking probably a difference of getting on for £500 million in the two scenarios. Well, if you're looking at the cost of the criminal justice system, the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office are both unprotected departments. So your prison places and the cost of providing them is in direct competition with your police officers on the beat. And I think we have to look at it to some extent in that way. If we look at the criminal justice system as a whole, how do we best want to spend the money to make sure that the public we serve is safe? Right? And I don't think it's as simple as saying that we can somehow discount the costs of prison places. I think we have to put them in the balance along with everything else, particularly when we're not very good at proving their effectiveness. And the Justice Committee in the House of Commons looked at this just before the election, and they said there was a sort of perception that the prison places were what they described as a free good, that somehow there wasn't a kind of cost attached to it, and as long as there was a demand for it, you had to keep providing the places. Well, I don't think that's true. You can control your number of prison places in a way you can't control maybe the number of school places you need or the number of hospital beds that you need. And I think we have to just make some decisions about priorities. Then I wanted just to say, Tom, I don't keep you for doing this. I want to say a couple of things then about some of the issues that I think the prison service and the police service have in common. And there are three, I think. The first one, and the obvious one, is you both lock people up. And we inspect both of you. And I think that some of the issues around locking people up are the same in both kind of contexts. So that the risks of, if you put people in a closed institution, behind closed walls, out of sight, that immediately creates risk. And if you think about, if you in a sense, perhaps in police custody where you've got people coming in and out, that's not as great. But think about Winterbourne View. Remember Winterbourne View, that the panorama expose where you had the young adults with learning difficulties locked in a home that nobody was looking at, that nobody was going into, and about what happened to them there. So you have that immediate risk if you have people out of sight, and certainly there'll be historic sex abuse cases or places like that will bring some of those issues to the fore. And you've got issues about and then within that, you've got such an extreme kind of power imbalance between the jailer and the detainee. And that's not merely about, necessarily about some people using physical force or whatever. It's about that places get run for the convenience of the institution. I remember one of the first police custody inspections I did was well, it's improved now, so I think I can name it. It was Wrexham. It was the custody suite in Wrexham. So I'm sorry if there's anybody here from North Wales. It's a lot better now because we've been back. And I went in, it was soon after I left the IPCC. And so I joined one of the custody inspections to see what it was like. And I went into the custody suite in Wrexham, and I got introduced. And you could see the custody sergeant thinking, this is all my nightmares in one person. You know, there's the head of the IPCC, and he seems to be HMIC, and he's the prison inspector, and he's come to look at what I'm doing. And you know, he showed me around, and he explained to me it was embarrassing. He explained to me that because they were short-staffed, they'd disabled the call bell, the cell call bell system. There was no integral sanitation, so he disabled that. And he explained to me he was apologizing for the fact that prisoners had to urinate on the floor. And his concern was that as my august personage made my way round the custody suite, I would have to sort of wade through this sticky mess to get round. His problem wasn't that they'd turned off the cell call bells and everyone was urinating on the floor. His problem was that I was going to be inconvenienced by the fact of it. So you have that kind of a place run in the interest of the staff rather than the interest of the people that are there. One of the things I think anybody in a public service should read, and if I had more time I'll talk about it, is the mid-staff's report into that as a really powerful example of how public institutions can go horribly wrong. And I think it has lessons not just for the NHS, I think it has lessons for all public services. The other thing that happens, and then of course if detainees complain, well, who's going to believe them for a start? And then you get what we would describe as the normative effects of custody. People just get used to things that they shouldn't get used to. So certainly we were in a custody suite kind of more recently, where the normal thing, if they detected they'd got that the standard practice is that if any detainee as so much as hinted at any kind of vulnerability, they were put in strip clothing and probably put in restraints, and they were using restraints far too often as well. And it was far in excess of what we see elsewhere. But in this place, it had just become normal practice. It was the way things were done and had become kind of normalized. And finally, the other kind of thing that we see in custody is what we describe as the virtual prison. And I'm sure there's virtual custody suites and probably virtual superintendents associations as well. The virtual prison is the one that the governor thinks he's running from the comfort of his office, which is very different from the real prison that's happening down on the wings. So you meet the governor and he'll tell you with complete sincerity about these happy, contented population and well-motivated staff and everybody going off to work and activities. And you go down on the wings and you find something kind of very different. And you get that yourself. You know, there will be, I'm sure Irene thinks she's presiding over these completely contented kind of membership of having wonderful services the whole time. There'll be a virtual superintendents association that will be different from what's really happening. There's certainly virtual police forces that are different from what the chief thinks is happening, I would suggest. So you have to find a way of kind of cutting through to the reality of what's actually going on. And that's true of police custody and prisons as well. The second thing that I think that police custody and prisons have in common is about risk. And I think that, I hope I wasn't responsible for any of this, I think we've got our attitudes as a society to risk kind of badly wrong. When I started at the IPCC, I remember one of the first things I did, I can't remember where it was now, I think it was in a London borough, but they decided to take me out in a police vehicle. And we were going along with, obviously, an experienced officer, and he pulled somebody over, and he wanted his insurance details, or there was a problem with his insurance. And he was talking to him, and then while that conversation was going on, he got an emergency call. He had to be somewhere, the car had to be somewhere else to go and deal with an incident. And the officer said to me, he said, look, I can be in trouble now because I've let this guy without the insurance papers go on. I've told him to bring them in the next day. If he has an accident now on the way driving home because I've got off to do something else, I'm in trouble. And I said, well, you know, I could see the point. And then a bit later on, I remember, I think it was when John Reed was Home Secretary, I went to a seminar that Ronnie Flanagan, when he was Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Magistrates Chief Inspector of Constabulary, had organised about trying to deal with risk. And I used this example. I said, look, you know, one of the things around risk, it seems to me, one of the ways explaining it to the public is about police pursuits. Right? If you have an incident, do you want the police to carry out the pursuit and catch the person they're after and prevent them doing harm? Or do you want them not to take that risk and to try and pick them up later? People can get the point about risk and pursuits. But it so happened that the person organizing the seminar, as it happened, had had a relative hurt in a police pursuit. So she didn't get the point kind of at all. Right? I think that, so I think we have to try and get a more thoughtful public discussion going on about risk, because there is a myth. It seems to me there's a myth that public services can somehow always prevent things from going wrong, that we can stop bad people doing bad things every time. And you can't. You can't do it with domestic violence, you can't do it with child abuse, you can't do it with crime, you can't stop bad things happening. And if you don't stop bad things happening, it's not the case that somebody is always to blame. Right? And I'll give you an example of this to close. I was, and it made a big impression, I thought about this a lot. One of the big things I did when I was at the IPCC is I was in charge of the investigation following the shooting of John Charles Menezes at Stockwell in 2005. And I'm sure some of you will kind of remember that. And one of the things, it's really odd, isn't it, if you're involved in an incident that then is kind of high profile, about how it then, a public narrative develops about what happened, that you know, or at least your experience of what happened is very different from the kind of received wisdom. Right? Now, there may be here that people here that are involved in that incident in some way, but this is what I remember or I understood about the incident. So first of all, you have the attacks on 7/7, 52 people killed, and that sort of sets the context for what was happening. Certainly anyone who lived in London at that time will remember that. And then 2 weeks later on the 21st, you get a failed attack, and the bombers, the would-be bombers, escape. So on the 22nd of July, the next day, you know there's been an attack that's killed 52 people, you know there's been another failed attack, and you know that the people who did it are still out there. And they trace one of the bombers to the flat in Tulse Hill, and then what happens is a whole series of small things, I think, start to go wrong. So Cressida Dick, who was the DSO, is misdirected when she arrives at Scotland Yard, so turns up at the briefing late and therefore can't have the sort of contact she wants to have with her team. They put a surveillance officer, I think is a special forces surveillance officer, outside the flats. But at the crucial moment that John Charles Menezes comes out, he's having a leak and his mind is on something else. They then follow John Charles Menezes, the surveillance team, because the firearms team hasn't yet arrived. They follow him and they get on the bus behind him. And they're having this discussion over the radio. Is it him? We're not sure. Is it him? We're not sure. And they just about get to the point where they've decided it's not the person they're after, when the bus pulls in at Brixton tube station, which is closed because of a bomb alert. So John Charles Menezes has got off the bus, gone to the tube station, discovered it's closed, so rushes back to the bus to carry on to Stockwell tube station. At which point all the surveillance officers go, anti-surveillance manoeuvre. And at that point, they sort of get in their heads that it's him. And they follow him into the tube, and they ask Cressida Dick what they should do. And Cressida Dick says, stop him. It's probably a mistake. What does stop him mean in that kind of context? And they follow him down to the tube, and he gets shot. And one of the things, and there's two bits of evidence about that are really important. One is that don't get seen enough. So there's often a lot of film shown of Menezes walking, John Charles walking carefully down, carefree down onto the platform. But then a bit later on, as the firearms officers arrive, you see them shouldering their way down the escalator as the first group of passengers are running up, panic-stricken, the other way. And then on the tube, there's essentially one of the surveillance officers has thrown himself on Menezes, and the firearms officers have fired the shots. And the surveillance officer is yelling at them, don't shoot me, I'm a cop. because they don't know each other and he's worried he's going to get caught up in the event. Anyhow, so we had at the IPC had to try and make some kind of sense of all of that. And it's important to remember that John Charles Moses was an entirely innocent man. He was a completely innocent and blameless man who did nothing to bring his fate upon himself. And there was, and I think there still is, a sense of, well, someone ought to be held accountable for what happened to him. Well, my question would be, well, who then? Who? Right? Because there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that by the time the firearms officers were going down into the tube station, they thought they were confronting a man with a bomb. So is it them? Is it them you want to have gripping the bar in the Old Bailey? Right? Or is it maybe it's Cressida Dick who was in charge, except when there was the health and safety trial and the jury specifically added a rider to their verdict, having heard her evidence that she was not in any way to blame. So we're going to contradict the jury who've heard all the evidence. So who is it that you want held responsible? And the lesson I took from that is the sad and terrible truth is, if anyone's to blame, it's the people who let off the bombs earlier in the month, right? And sometimes stuff just goes wrong, right? And you need to make a distinction between things going wrong and people doing wrong. So if people abuse their powers or they willfully neglect their duties, then I think they should be held to account. But if people are trying, be they in a prison or be they on the streets, if people are trying to do a very difficult thing and they're doing it the best they can, and sometimes actually what they're doing isn't brilliant, but they're not trying to create harm, and they don't bring it off, right? Then I don't think the best way to deal with that is by the full force of the law and some disciplinary sanction. And I think we need to, and if you do that, if we see everything as somebody's fault, if we get the view that somehow or other the public services can prevent these things happening, what you'll create is public services that are risk-averse, that are unwilling to learn, that won't experiment with new things. And I don't think that's in our interest. Now, sometimes I think actually you, the police force, are as much to blame as anybody else in this. Quick to raise the finger, quick to come sometimes to point the finger, quick sometimes, I think, to come to too crude a judgment about complex issues, and then that kind of rebounds on you. So I think what we need to do, both in terms of kind of police discipline, but also more widely in public services, in social services, dealing with child abuse cases, in prison staff, trying to manage some very difficult men and boys, and in the police service, trying to do their jobs in the streets. I think we need to make a better distinction between doing wrong and going wrong, and not assume that you can solve everything, because you can't. Thank you.